All right, let's jump right in. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to be unpacking one of the absolute most complex, consequential, and heavily debated figures in human history, J. Robert Oppenheimer. This is really a story about the staggering weight of a single scientific legacy. It's the story of a man who literally handed humanity the power to destroy itself. But to really understand Oppenheimer, we've got to look past all the myths and look directly at the reality of what he built, why he built it, and how it completely broke him.
Now, what's really interesting about this quote here is the context. Picture this. It's July 16, 1945, 5:30 in the morning, out in the New Mexico desert. The very first nuclear bomb is detonated, and as Oppenheimer watches a literal sun ignite on Earth, he's so profoundly shocked by the devastation that he quotes the Bhagavad Gita, saying, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It's a bone-chilling realization, right? He knew in that exact fraction of a second that the world would never ever be the same.
And that brings us directly to the core conflict of our explainer today. History handed Oppenheimer a seemingly impossible role. He was forced to walk this razor-thin tightrope between unparalleled scientific triumph on one side and catastrophic moral devastation on the other. So as we go through the facts from our source material today, I want you to just keep this question rolling around in the back of your mind. Was the father of the atomic bomb a hero who raced to save the world, or a villain who doomed it?
Part 1. The Father of the Bomb, A Genius Awakens.
So, before the 1930s, Julius Robert Oppenheimer was living in this completely isolated academic bubble. I mean, he was a massive child prodigy, delivering high-level physics lectures by age 12, but he really struggled with depression. He even famously claimed he needed physics more than friends. But as Hitler's tyranny started rising in Germany, that isolation just couldn't hold. Brilliant German Jewish scientists, guys like Albert Einstein and Edward Teller, they were fleeing to America. And seeing the atrocities committed against Jewish people, well, it yanked Oppenheimer right out of his academic shell. As he stated in 1936, he finally grasped how deeply political events affect people's lives, and this totally sparked a political awakening for him, drawing him toward left-leaning ideologies and labor union causes.
Part 2. Race against Nazi Germany.
Now, that political awakening violently collided with a really terrifying reality. Hitler's scientists were actively working on a nuclear weapon. The race for survival was officially on. The crazy thing here is just how fast everything escalated. Let's walk through this timeline really quick. August 1939, Einstein and Leo Szilard urgently warned President Roosevelt that Hitler might build an unimaginably powerful bomb. So America starts researching. Then, boom, December 1941, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and America is thrust into World War II. By August 1942, the military takes over the atomic research, which officially launches the Manhattan Project. And despite all these military concerns about Oppenheimer's left-wing ties, they decide he is absolutely essential. So by July 1943, he takes the helm of Project Y, the massive secret lab out in the Pecos Valley of New Mexico.
To really grasp the insane amount of pressure Oppenheimer was under, just look at this number. The U.S. government poured $2.2 billion into this project. And if you adjust that for inflation, we're talking roughly $24 billion today. It's mind-blowing. They literally built entire secret cities from scratch, like Oak Ridge, Tennessee, employing tens of thousands of people just to separate uranium isotopes. The government was betting an astronomical fortune on what was, at the time, just theoretical science.
And right at the very center of that multi-billion-dollar gamble was this one crucial concept: critical mass. The absolute minimum amount of radioactive material needed to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. Oppenheimer's specific genius was needed to calculate exactly how much uranium-235 or plutonium it would take to trigger a massive explosion. Now sure, that sounds simple to us today, but back then, they were dealing with completely unknown factors. They were practically writing the rulebook for atomic physics in real time.
Actually, this detail perfectly illustrates just how crazy complex the engineering was. They were so unsure of what would work that they developed two entirely different bomb mechanisms at the exact same time. On one hand, you had Little Boy. This used a gun-type design, basically slamming two subcritical pieces of uranium-235 together. But then you had plutonium, which was incredibly volatile. A gun design would just melt it down. So for the plutonium bomb, known as Fat Man, they had to invent a completely unproven implosion method. This meant using conventional explosives on the outside of a sphere to crush the plutonium inward until it hit that critical mass.
Part 3. The Trinity Test, Triumph and Terror.
Because this implosion method was so new and totally theoretical, Oppenheimer insisted they had to run a physical test. So on that fateful morning, July 16, 1945, they hoisted a test bomb, literally just called Gadget, 100 feet up in the air on a steel tower. Now, Oppenheimer calculated the blast would yield roughly 0.3 kilotons of TNT. But look at this. The actual blast yielded 15 to 20 kilotons. It was 50 times larger and vastly more dangerous than even the brilliant Oppenheimer had expected.
The physical devastation of this test was just awe-inspiring and utterly terrifying. The sheer, incomprehensible heat literally evaporated the entire steel tower. The shockwave slammed into observers who were 160 kilometers away. This massive mushroom cloud just ripped 12 kilometers straight up into the sky. It was so hot that the desert sand superheated into a radioactive green glass that they actually named Trinidite. Now, on an academic level, it was an absolute triumph of theoretical physics. But for Oppenheimer, watching that blinding flash, the triumph immediately curdled into deep existential dread.
Part 4. The reality Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Okay, let's slow down for a second here, because this is where our narrative takes a massive pivot. Theoretical physics and testing in an empty desert is one thing. But less than a month later, in August 1945, that science was translated into a brutal, devastating reality. The little boy bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. And when the reality of these weapons hit the world, the scientific community's reactions were profoundly divided. Albert Einstein felt this deep, heavy melancholy, famously comparing humanity to mice building their own trap. But Oppenheimer's initial reaction? It was actually a sort of grim satisfaction. He was glad the weapon worked. In fact, his only regret in that immediate moment was that they hadn't finished it soon enough to use against Hitler and Nazi Germany.
Part 5. The Moral Shift. A Scientist's Guilt.
But, that initial satisfaction absolutely did not last. When that second bomb fell on Nagasaki, something fundamental just broke inside Oppenheimer. He had somehow justified Hiroshima as a necessary evil to end the war, but Nagasaki horrified him. The hero of Los Alamos, the father of the atomic bomb himself, was suddenly terrified of the future he had just created. He almost instantly became one of the fiercest critics of his own work. He desperately wanted to shove the nuclear genie back into the bottle. Just look at the steps he took here. By August 17th, we're talking mere days after Nagasaki, he travels directly to Washington to hand-deliver a letter to the Secretary of War, stating his deep regret and literally begging to ban nuclear weapons. He then throws himself into working with the newly formed U.S. Atomic Energy Commission to establish strict oversight. And when the U.S. government pushes to build an even more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb, Oppenheimer fiercely and very publicly opposes the whole thing. This massive moral crusade came to a head in October 1945. Oppenheimer manages to get a sit-down with the new U.S. president, Harry Truman. Oppenheimer walks right into the Oval Office, looks at the president, and bluntly confesses, "I have blood on my hands." Well, as you can imagine, that did not go over well. President Truman was absolutely infuriated by the scientist's guilt. He started shouting, ordered his secretary to throw Oppenheimer out, and flat out declared he never wanted to see his face in that office again.
And the government definitely made sure he paid a steep price for his conscience. Because he dug his heels in against the hydrogen bomb, and because political enemies dragged up those old left-wing ties from the 1930s, Oppenheimer was entirely stripped of his security clearance and all his political influence. Think about that. The man who the military deemed absolutely essential to ending the World War was just casually discarded by his own government. He spent his final years as an academic exile, giving quiet lectures, until he eventually passed away from throat cancer at age 62.
Part 6. The Legacy. Hero or Villain.
Now, our job in this explainer is to present the facts completely neutrally, directly from the historical sources. But ultimately, it's up to you to weigh them. So let's look at the two fiercely opposing viewpoints. The case for him being a hero argues that Oppenheimer boldly stepped up to stop Nazi Germany from getting the bomb first. He provided brilliant, completely unprecedented scientific leadership, and then crucially, he used his massive platform to aggressively advocate for global arms control. Now, on the flip side, the case for him being a villain argues that regardless of his noble intentions or his later feelings of guilt, he still willingly created the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, a weapon that directly enabled unprecedented, catastrophic civilian casualties in Japan. And we really can't ignore the permanent, world-altering reality of what the Manhattan Project actually accomplished. As of today, there are 9 countries that possess nuclear weapons. The unimaginable power he handed over to humanity, that isn't going anywhere.
It is just an incredibly heavy, fascinating story.
History handed J. Robert Oppenheimer the power of a god, but ultimately, he was forced to live out the rest of his days with the conscience of a man. He built the ultimate weapon to try and save the world, only to spend the rest of his life completely terrified of what he'd unleashed. So, having looked at the full picture of his life, the incredible science, and that profound moral shift after the tests, what do you think? Was he a hero or a villain? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the history around you.